Hi, I'm Sarah Mirk. I'm a contributing editor with The Nib, and I'm here today with Nate Powell. Hi, Nate.
Hi there, how you doing?
I'm good. So Nate is the author of many books, which are all wonderful, but his newest book is this beautiful one called Save It for Later, and the subtitle is Promises, Parenthood, and the Urgency of Protest. So this book is a series of essays, I would say, about sort of thinking through how to talk to your kids and the rest of your family about the issues that are in our society today, about white supremacy, about masculinity, about violence, gun violence. Can you tell me what the through line is for you in these essays?
I guess like the origin which sort of compelled me to make these happen was simply living through the last 5 years in particular, seeing the acceleration of so much stuff happening all the time that very quickly I could tell that I and most people I knew had a sense that there just wasn't enough bandwidth to air the more personal, subjective, intimate experiences surrounding the push against authoritarianism. And that means a lot of the fear, the anxiety, the doubt, problems eating and sleeping, and especially how to equip young people with the tools that they need to be able to tackle this very foreboding future that's arriving very quickly for them. And I recognize that like we're not really going to repair a lot of this damage unless we carve out that space. You know, it's natural to feel like this isn't the time to be talking about personal stuff because we've got 100 fires burning at once that really need effort. And all of that is true, but a lot of this is also, you know, kind of bowing to normalization of authoritarianism and being like, oh, right, the personal side of this, the things that actually allow us to relate to people who may not be as similar to us in every aspect of life, we are losing that. And losing that thread is a key obstacle to actually kind of bridging gaps and repairing a lot of damage.
I really appreciate that idea where like we're so inundated with horrible news every day and like horrible fascist realities of our country and the world, that it's really hard to take time to reflect on that and to think about what does this mean for our future? What does this mean about our history? Where does this come from and where are we going?
Without a doubt. And I'd say a lot of it also has to do with these sort of kind of a forced binary approach to what it means to be active and engaged as a neighbor or as a citizen or as a protester. And I think there's a natural tendency, especially when there's so much stuff that should and does require our engagement and our effort. There's damage done by all of us having this, to a degree, this notion that you are either an activist who is active or you are not. And so one of the major subthreads, I think, that I focus on is that there is value in embracing the reality that it's okay to be a person who shows up. By supporting the actual activists and organizers who put so much time and effort and risk into making these larger protests and movements capable of affecting our world and our society, does require a broad cross-section of people just being willing to do the work of showing up as much as possible, and also trusting that when you can't, other people are going to have your back to fill in the gaps, and thus it's your responsibility to do the same in turn. It's okay to kind of take the pressure off and make it less about your own hand wringing. Like, know your limitations and do what you can and continue reassessing that.
You start at the book saying this is not a parenting book or an activist guide, and you say that is not my place. I only know my own experiences, and here they are. So why did that feel important to you to be like, this is just my own personal experience? And what did you really want to steer clear from in this book?
A lot of that was kind of trying to think a year ahead or 6 months ahead in the future as I was wrapping up the book, and trying to think about it like, you know, when you publish a story on any platform, it's you know, you lose a large degree of control over the reception of what you tried to make, which is why we work so hard to craft something that really speaks from a place of truth. So I basically tried to get in front of the train and be like, what are the easiest ways in which the content and the intent behind this book can be misconstrued, or how easily could this book be dismissed, perhaps? And the biggest two would be that, yes, this book is really centered around my experiences as a parent, and also that intergenerational exchange with me as a child of my baby boomer parents. And so there's a lot of parenting going on in this book, but being like, okay, it's not my intention to tell you how to navigate, your kids through this and how to do a better job as a parent. Likewise, by embracing the fact that I'm not what I would consider to be an activist, it's important to sort of lay that out to like get around any sort of misguided notion of hypocrisy, but also to embrace a lot of the hypocrisy of me and lots of people trying to do the most that they can do with a limited range of time, resources, with other things going on in life, and with other ways to apply our energy. And so I thought, yeah, it would be easiest to misconstrue this as, to dismiss it as a parenting book that doesn't work in that way, or an activist guidebook that doesn't focus enough on that. That there's such huge chunks of potential in the book, but it's a matter of scope. It's a matter of understanding what my intended scope of the book is, and to let other people who can speak much better about activism or parenting advice, let them do that work. Just in the same way that when I'm writing about contemporary events involving fascism and white supremacy and police violence in the United States, there are other people who I'm reading and paying attention to who are doing a much better job. And it's not my job to try to reinvent or represent their wheel. So knowing my place.
Yeah, I think it's really a tough balance between understanding that like you have a story to tell that is valuable, and then also like, why are you the person that gets to tell your story?
Yes.
How did you feel about sort of like putting your own voice and experiences out there? I think a lot of the other work you've done has been either fictional, so kind of like magical realist,
yes,
fantasy, I would say. And then for the last few years, you worked on the series March, where you were the illustrator of a book written by Rep. John Lewis and Andrew Aiden. And so, like, how did you feel like, I want to put my own voice and experiences forward in this book, and what are the challenges or the drawbacks you thought of that?
That's a good way to put it. In a nutshell, it's the difference between wanting and needing, feeling compelled to put my own experiences. I back in the like mid 2000s, I did some autobiographical comics essays that Top Shelf published as Please Release. But my home planet, yes, really is fiction. And in the previous 5 or 6 years, I've really settled into a complete lack of interest in doing autobiographical or memoir comics. Like, who cares? Who cares about my daily life? However, this is where it takes a while to recognize that there are multiple personal and creative values to making comics. And so throughout 2017, the sort of, originating impetus behind this book being that, as I was previously saying, that this perceived lack of bandwidth for people to kind of air the more personal reactions and experiences through this authoritarian power grab. It was important for me to start writing and drawing these experiences down in my sketchbook, because another product of normalization under authoritarianism is already losing a sense of perspective and freshness and clarity on your own memories, starting to cast doubt on your own experiences and memories, second guess yourself. And as we continue to become normalized, it becomes almost like a process of self-gaslighting. And so for a lot of it, like, I needed to remember these moments, whether it was from summer 2016 or the morning after the presidential election or January 2017. There were a lot of scenes and experiences and exchanges amongst my family members and I that needed to find a place to go. And once I realized that there was some value in that, I really wanted to make a slim 96-page book in like 6 months and get it out immediately. And a lot of that just was for therapeutic value and for the airing of grievances. But that changed. Like, a lot of it has to do with, you pay attention to when the scope or the potential of your work changes. And so I started at the same time doing more essay-centered work, most notably about face. And by the time I was wrapping that essay up in late 2018, it became apparent that the memoir parts and these more objective essay parts were the same project, and that there was a back and forth that was enriching each perspective in storytelling.
Yeah, this book is really rooted in your family, your wife and 2 daughters, and the place where you live, Bloomington, Indiana. So I think I was struck, as somebody who's never lived in Indiana, about your experiences seeing a lot of like Blue Lives Matter signs, Punisher flags, Confederate flags all around, and trying to explain those symbols to your daughters. Can you kind of talk about how you started drawing comics about Bloomington and about your experiences seeing these fascist symbols around?
Certainly. I mean, I guess as a setup, a lot of my work in my 2011 book, Any Empire, was a direct result of, well, I'm an Arkansan. I spent my entire youth, basically growing up throughout the South. And I was definitely, like many people of my generation, especially white Southerners, I grew up being taught and believing that the South was the backwards racist part of America. I sort of brought that baggage when I moved here 17 years ago. It took several years for me to really settle in enough in the lower Midwest to begin to look around with more clarity. A lot of it thanks to James Loewen's book, Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism, which is really centered around smashing a lot of the South-centered view of white supremacy as a structure throughout America by illuminating the other dimensions of forced inequality and segregation, Indiana being one of the worst culprits in the United States. And so starting 2007, 2008, I started seeing a lot of these kind of emerging paramilitary signs and a more kind of like white grievance on public display at rush hour here in Bloomington. And it had an apocalyptic tone, though it's the kind of thing that is, you're just seeing in passing as an observer, yet it carried this feeling that something was building. Nowadays, I feel that 2007 really was the tipping point that brought us into our current era. But specifically, the fact that, like, living in a nominally progressive college town in a deeply conservative, much more racially and culturally homogenous part of the Midwest, there's a very powerful dynamic tension between this college town and the area surrounding it, but also, like, there are a lot of false assumptions about what a liberal college town is, who makes it up, and what the dynamic is within the town. And so the longer I live here, the more I see things, in my opinion, with alarming clarity. And like by the end of 2017, with a lot of the easy to notice symbols like new late model, blacked out tough guy trucks, and a lot of the bumper sticker culture and iconography coming up, it was so obvious to me, but simply the fact that no one else was writing or drawing in a way that was making connections that I was seeing every day as I was driving through town. I really felt like it was my cartoonist responsibility to put the relationships between a lot of these shifting aesthetics into some sort of organized way, mostly to clarify my own thoughts and then to hopefully get it out into the world.
What kind of connections did you see that you felt like nobody else was talking about?
Like this is where, yeah, like in 2016 and 2017, it's the kind of stuff that takes a while to sink in. But like especially growing up in the 80s as a GI Joe kid in a military family, I sort of grew up with a lot of emerging questions about military regulation and style, the purposes behind them, and the functions of conformity and regulation. So this is where, as a kid, I was asking my dad all kinds of highly specific questions about insignia, symbols, haircut lengths, facial hair, the reasonings why there were limitations to so many of these in military service. And, you know, I got good answers for them, but starting really back in the mid 2000s, when there was a reemergence of the allowance of facial hair on certain US troops, there were quiet questions, you know, that took a while to really get any kind of answer for. And it took until like the reemergence of the beard on, you know, active duty service members trickled its way back down into a paramilitary presence, then a law enforcement presence. It's important to recognize that like seeing bearded cops is not something that you commonly saw 15 years ago. Like this really is like a style and aesthetic issue that that points its way towards, when coupled with the emergence of the Punisher skull as a symbol of authoritarian, often white supremacist force, a symbol of being above the law, and the emergence of the blue line flag, etc. All these combine in just apolitical consumer culture as a way of normalizing paramilitary and fascist presence. And that doesn't even necessarily cast blame on the people who are buying and selling and becoming consumers and adopters as a way of like buying into adjacency with authoritarianism. I mean, it really is just like man children who are essentially cosplaying as tough guys. But, you know, my big takeaway is that cosplaying Nazis are just Nazis.
Yeah, I think some of the most powerful parts of this book are about like white supremacy, white privilege, and masculinity, and the connections between those three things. So when you're putting this book together, what did you really want the audience to take away from it? Is this something that you're hoping that like white people, white men in your town will read and learn from? Or are you thinking of the audience as more people like your daughters who are growing up in this time and trying to understand it and have not yet calcified their views?
That's a good question. I think in a nutshell, on a personal level, the thing I'm anxious about is like white boys in my town reading the book. But, you know, thankfully the level of, you know, heavy readership amongst the bearded wraparound Oakley's tough guy demographic is pretty low. So I'm not too concerned about that. To me, the book and the experiences I encapsulate seem to have the most value, I think, for Millennial and Generation X parents and people whose lives are, you know, intersect with those of the children in their lives. But also, importantly, I think there's a lot of value in this book for baby boomers, for the people who are my parents. And a lot of focus on the book is about connections, in my opinion, between Generation X and baby boomers, and a shared set of erroneous assumptions about the inevitability of social progress. A lot of this just coming of age between World War II and 9/11. And this also being to a strong degree relative to, you know, white privilege, but the privilege of having an assumption that the arc of the moral universe bends on its own, that things will work themselves out. And so seeing especially early in 2017, seeing a lot of baby boomers and my parents and their friends, and like a general inability to grasp that the rules no longer apply, that the right thing wouldn't necessarily happen just because it was so obvious that it should happen, that things weren't going to work themselves out because systems were failing. that we were in this position because systems failed. So I think there's a large sort of baby boomer readership of parents and grandparents, and then also people around my age who are parents, teachers. Hopefully it'll be valuable for, you know, people my kids' age once they are 15 or 16 or 17, but we shall see.
So you've spent the last, I don't know how many years of your life working on the March series. How many years altogether did you spend on that series?
It was about 4.5 years drawing the book with a little bit of lead time. And then we still regularly toured for another 3.5 years afterwards. So all in all, it was about 8.5 years of our lives together.
Wow. And what do you feel like you learned from creating that series that you brought to this book, both as a writer and as a cartoonist?
I'd say even prior to this book, I was able to, I think, like in a lot of ways, doing the March trilogy was like sending myself back to school to relearn the history of the civil rights movement and of organized nonviolence. And it helped kind of undo a lot of assumptions that I was taught about civil rights movement history. But from a cartooning perspective and from a writing perspective, having to grapple with that amount of information and to be able to minimize the textual content, which is already very dense, and really lean on the reader's capacity to draw information in a nonverbal way out of artwork in panels, being able to make those connections, and also trusting in the reader's ability to be moved by the more subjective first-person experiences in which I'm trying to get inside young John Lewis's mind and heart and sort of bring the subjective components out, which can't accurately be described, you know, in historic nonfiction text, but which are essential to the humanity of the moment and the truth of the moment. I think I was able to bring that concreteness and clarity and bring that balance between subjective and objective back into my fiction to kind of allow my fiction to fly while remaining a little more grounded. And returning to nonfiction with Save It for Later, I feel like I was in a much better place to be able to organize my thoughts so that I could present them in a way that didn't make me sound unhinged or paranoid. And that's that's another part of the impetus of this book, is being afraid that your own thoughts and experiences are just paranoia. So yeah, the organizing components and the ability to kind of like temper my own statements and choose words carefully and not provide too much or too little information, that was crucial.
I'm struck by what you said about like wanting to present a lot of information on the page, but with minimal text, and letting the readers like absorb a lot of information just through the visuals. And I think that that's something that's really, really like the secret to comics. It's something that's tricky to do, is to, I think you play it safe by putting in a lot of text and just explaining everything textually, because then you know that like the reader is going to get what you're going for. But the power of comics is to create an emotional reality through images. So did you find yourself both in March and in this book like striking text and you know, having a lot you wanted to say and then like crossing it out, backing away and being like, no, I'm just going to show a face that conveys this emotion, or a scene that conveys this feeling, and I don't even need to put any words on there?
Yes, I'd say a lot of the interplay in March between Andrew as writer and me had to do with finding what that balance was. As we learned to work together, I was a little more heavy-handed in the very beginning in terms of looking out for show don't tell moments and you know, crossing off redundant descriptions and captions, whereas at the same time Andrew was paying attention to the storytelling as I was adapting his script and learning how to shift focus in his textual information in a way that allowed the artwork to enrich the text without overlapping. So I think I tried as much as I could to push that even further here, because this is where the power of doing this kind of memoir as a comic lay in the capacity for a reader to project themselves and their own experiences on this. Because again, like, who cares about what I have to say about my experiences with it? The reason why the book exists is because so many of these experiences were perceived, and these emotional states, by a significant majority of American adults. And that even goes like into, rational, sane, moderate conservatives who, felt a lot of the same anxiety and fear and disappointment and rage, but were under, extra susceptibility to the power of normalizing authoritarian force to kind of shove that discontent down very quickly. So a lot of it is, recognizing this is my family's experience, but if I do it right, and a lot of that having to do with really leaning on the imagery to allow a reader to project their own lives into those characters, into those scenes, which are familiar in different ways to them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was hoping to ask you about the layouts in the book, because you have a really unique layout style that creates a sense of pacing and I think like spaciousness. The essays themselves are actually not that long, but I think they feel like more like they have more depth because you're just doing a few images per page with all this negative space around it. So it really sinks in and feels important. Can you talk a little bit about your layout design and your approach to pacing in the book?
Certainly. I think the most revolutionary influence for me in terms of layout, pacing, and negative space is Chester Brown. I think the original black the black margin and gutter version of I Never Liked You is what changed my entire perspective on what page layouts could be, how flow can work from top to bottom. The first time I ever saw a splash page that wasn't a full bleed page, but a small panel contained by darkness on all sides, that changed me forever in the mid-90s. And so sometimes this is where comics are just expressionism. In order to feel like you are drowning in a moment or you're caught in a moment, doing stuff like maximizing margin and gutter space, removing panel borders so that an image seems to, in your mind, extend to infinity while surrounded by just darkness. These give us an automatic response that isn't even conscious, that sort of sets a stage so that no other setup is required for mood or tone. And there are moments like in March Book 3, for example, as Andrew and the congressman and our editor Lee and I were wading through a fixed page count from the get-go with a lot of dense historical material which had to be included. Nothing that's in the book could have been removed. We were left with very slim options to sort of be expansive and free, devoid, in moments that weren't leaning on the historical information. So there were moments where we knew we had to carve it out for, a couple of very minimal breather splash pages, which may have been very heavy in terms of their content, but spatially, visually offered room for the reader to take a rest, to take a beat. So I brought that definitely into Save It for Later as well, recognizing that, I work rhythmically with sort of like cascading panels. Like I love getting to the bottom right of a page, and I love thinking of panels as stair steps whenever possible. But also the sheer density of some parts of the book, like About Face, require the airiness of certain other passages, like the morning after election day and sort of getting up and having to go through the routines of still making breakfast for your kids, helping them brush their teeth, going to preschool. And those are the moments which allow everything to sort of settle in, and all in all, the book has a balance with a dynamic between that density and that sparseness.
Yeah, that's really beautifully said. I love thinking of panels as stairs, and what you said about them sort of escalating toward the bottom corners is really interesting. And then I was curious about what tone you were trying to hit for the book. I think it can be really tough in writing about these topics because you don't want to seem like overly optimistic or hopeful. You know, I think like you're a pretty cynical realist about the world, but then you don't just want to like beat people over the head with like how depressing and apocalyptic things are. So what kind of tone are you hoping these essays leave with readers?
Well, my actual feelings about our place in our world and the preservation of democracy is that no, I am not hopeful. It's important for people to see things with clarity, to understand just how bad things were, just how bad things are, and just how close we were and still are to losing what we take for granted as the survival of our democracy. It's important to see and understand that. But I know that we can get through this. It simply requires all of us to see things with clarity, to recognize that there are things that we need to do and have to do, and that it doesn't have to be kind of a monolithic approach to each person and each family and each community's sense of civic engagement. There aren't boxes to check. This is something that we can do, but we don't have time to have a breather now. We didn't have time to have a breather in 2016. And it's a matter of like really emphasizing that if you know that we collectively made a huge mistake with our set of assumptions that things would work out, now is the time to follow through on that, to keep up our pressure, to keep up a moral core behind what we are doing together, and we can get out of this. But the time for messing around is over.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Can you talk about the title for the book? Save it for later is a phrase that comes up in the later chapters during the pandemic. So your family is like really stuck at home during lockdown, during quarantine from COVID-19. And this phrase, save it for later, keeps coming up. So can you explain what it means to you and why you made it the title of the book?
You bet. Well, all of my solo books so far in my career have been retitled at some point. So originally this book was called Tornado Children, which is the title of the chapter, which basically encapsulates 2020 up to the point in which it was time to send the book to the printer. And you know, for practical reasons, you know, there's a back and forth, a balance between a creator and the publisher. And so they're like, this is a really evocative title. Let's try to find some kind of balance that, because it's evocative, but to a degree, like sometimes with sales and marketing people, like they don't know how to pitch a book that seems to produce an image in your head that is not literally corresponding to the content in the book.
I love that. They're like, it's really powerful. It makes no sense. Please change the title.
That was the exchange, basically being like, there are no tornadoes in this book. And I was like, that's true. There are no tornadoes in the book. Anyway, so I wound up coming up with 100 other titles that was like, it was almost like a matrix of permutations of different phrasing that I thought helped encapsulate what I was trying to hit at with Tornado Children, which was, you know, bringing young people being equipped to move through a turbulent, ever-changing, foreboding landscape and future. That was it. So I kept coming back to the double meanings of sometimes a computer or app command or option, save for later, like come back, circle back around to it, be like, oh, I'll get to that in a little while, coupled with the literal interpretation, save it for later, for the future. Like, let us have a future that our kids can grow into, in which democracy survives, in which the dignity and worth of human beings is acknowledged, valued, and followed through on. I liked the dynamic tension between these two sort of flip sides of the phrase. Then 2020 happened. So I locked in the title, Save It for Later, before the world shut down. But then within the first 2 weeks of the pandemic, it occurred to me that several times a day, every day, I've been cautioning my kids, whether it was like candy, toilet paper, paper towels, hand sanitizer, bread. I was like, you guys, we can't be cooking with ingredients in the kitchen. You got to save it for later. Like, you better watch that, kids. Save that for later. We don't know when we're getting more. And so eventually I was like, dear my publishers, yeah, it turns out save it for later is definitely the jam. I have caught myself saying it 6 times a day in different contexts. And so as each day went on, it almost became like a joke in my family that I'd be like, I hate to say this, guys, but we need to save that for later. I'm so sorry.
Turns out you're a dad.
Yes, yes.
I want to hear some of the other 100 titles. Do you mind sharing a few that didn't make the
Yeah.
cut?
Let me think about the ones that weren't just reimaginings of, oh, I already put my master binder up. Maybe this is it.
Can I also see the master binder?
Let's see. Oh yeah, this is basically along the way with all my books. As I scan and print out things in progress, like I've just put them in the binder so that I'm not looking at a screen all the time. But I have the alternate titles stuffed away in here somewhere. Can't find them right now, and my mind is too crammed to remember them, unfortunately.
That's okay. I'm glad I got to see the binder.
You bet.
Let's see. I think that's all my questions for you, Nate.
Sure. You bet.
In saying goodbye, can you share us with that cat in the background?
Oh,
I've been staring at your cat this whole time.
So happy to. All right, this is my chat cat. He's my familiar. This dude, his little name is Bruce. He's he's sleepy and grumpy, but he's a fancy guy. He's clearly like he ran away from a rich person's house, and he's a little snobby, but he chose me for whatever reason, and he follows me 24 hours a day, and he just barely tolerates anyone else. But over the last year, this has been like the happiest year of his life because he just gets to be a foot away from me all day and all night. So, back to business, Bruce.
Well, thank you so much, Nate, for taking the time to talk with me, and thanks for making this book.
I'm happy to have made it. I hope that it makes some kind of a difference, or at least lets people feel less alone.